My name is Sandeep Nayak. I'm a psychiatrist. So I recently finished I got about a year ago, I finished my psychiatric training. I'm currently a research postdoc at the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic Research. So primarily what I'm doing is the clinical trials, which is kind of where my passion lies in this field.
What got you personally into psychedelics research? As casually or as in depth as you like, is there anything, any original inspiration, anything in particular that drove you in this direction or to work in this area?
Sure. So, I mean, the very, very short answer is that there's real potential to improve people's lives. And it's exciting kind of getting in early and having a sense of being able to shape the direction in some small way that's going to take. But the longer answer kind of relates more to how this field is like it perfectly pieces together all of these different interests that I have that I never really expected to converge. I mean, you know, I'm a psychiatrist, so obviously I have clinical interest in treating people with various types of mental disorders. But I also separately had an interest in mysticism and mindfulness. I was involved in mindfulness research, and that was just sort of a separate thing. I had an interest in addiction and behavior change, which again, I mean, these things kind of you're able to make them communicate, but they never felt that they naturally joined. And yeah, I mean, I read Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception in middle school, and it made such a huge impact on me. But it was just as a curiosity. In college, I studied Buddhist philosophy, but again, it just kind of felt this separate, disparate things. I was working with an addiction population. And then once I entered psychiatry, developed this interest in addiction psychiatry, realized that I could wrap all of this together in the field of psychedelics. Everything just kind of came together. So yeah, basically it has turned like lifelong interest in just various disparate topics that in some ways I felt like maybe I was wasting my time or not doing what I was supposed to be doing. And it just has made everything converge in a way that's actually useful. And I also just find it exciting that because this is such a new field in a way, well, new, but basically there's a real
renaissance of sorts that's occurring.
Renaissance.
It's not new, but there's some new aspects that are being explored. Maybe one way of putting it. Yeah, sorry.
And there's so many different people that are involved with this, so many different ways of trying to understand how to use psychedelics or how to understand them. And there's a real, very, very basic need to come up with concepts that can tie all this together. So I find that exciting as well.
This will touch on another question I want to ask is like, how do you see the field changing in a couple of years? But I'm curious, just for you personally, what I understand a bit now what brought you here, how this connects, you know, the psychiatry and your interest in mindfulness and some of the, but what keeps you here now? What, like right now in this moment, what's really pulling your motivation or grounding your interest? It's a bit of a weird question, I know, but.
Yeah, I mean, so.
It could be the same answer even.
There's different ways I could answer that. I mean, I'm a temperamental pessimist. And so I've been at this postdoc for a year, just about, and even right before starting it, so not that long ago, I was still very much of the mentality that, you know, something's going to go wrong, the government's going to shut down, the funding will dry up, or something. And just the explosion of, I mean, the momentum that has occurred over the last several years, it just makes it hard for me to continue to hold on to those beliefs that this isn't, you know, this is very likely to become a real available treatment. But even so, I mean, my mentality truly going into it was like, you know, even if this blows up, it doesn't work out, I'll get a couple of years of doing this really amazing work. I mean, I find it so fascinating and energizing doing the actual, the clinical sessions, these research studies. I mean, it's just the best thing in the world, you know, like it's just intrinsically rewarding, almost separate from like what might come of it. I just find it so fascinating and engaging. And so that's kind of what keeps me going, I think.
Awesome. Okay, so the rewarding side of it, or the rewarding parts of it aside, what would you say is one of the big stumbling blocks, or perhaps misconceptions, or just misunderstandings that you've currently had to deal with?
I think it's changing. It doesn't, but there's like new misconceptions too.
Oh, yeah.
Like one example, especially as you're getting more and more people who are not actually, I mean, many people who are like wouldn't otherwise take psychedelics. Like these are not psychedelic enthusiasts. They're just looking to feel better.
Mhm.
But okay, so one misconception is that psychedelic therapy is going to be a magic bullet. I mean, like an overly rosy picture of like how effective they're going to be, not only for individuals, but just across the board. I mean, people believe that it's going to completely replace conventional psychiatry. It's going to, I mean, you can take it to an extreme, but another piece of that magic bullet misconception is that a lot of the work or benefit comes after the dose, after the day
Mhm.
ends, where it's like, now you have to make sense of this. Now you have to work it into your life in a way that you can actually take with you months and years from now. And that's not a given. I mean, that does require some work. And so that's one of the things that I've found surprising is how much actually has to be done after the drug wears off in the days and weeks to make any potential benefit stay.
Yeah.
There's other misconceptions though, apart from the clinical stuff. I mean, I think a lot of people, well, okay, an easy one is this naturalistic fallacy. I mean, lots of people believe that like the natural compounds are somehow better than synthetic ones.
Mhm.
But another version of that is that this idea that what is being done with therapeutic like psilocybin use is, you know, at best recapitulating some indigenous therapeutic use. And it kind of like casts this kind of modern work as being some inferior version of some therapeutic work that was being
That's,
done across millennia.
I do hear this echoed quite often, actually, that, yeah, okay, it's great that we're doing this, that, psychedelics, let's say psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or whatever, but there's no way that, at best, this is a watered down version of the ancient rituals. And, I definitely have heard it said, oh, without actually doing it with a shaman, or in a clinical setting, there's no way that you could, emulate a setting that's effective. And so am I hearing correctly that you would disagree with this perspective, or that you would at least challenge the perspective that there's no way to get the most out of this in the way that we're currently doing it? It sounds like you're not as pessimistic about about the benefits as you
Yeah,
are about the industry.
I do kind of disagree with that. First off, not all indigenous use of psychedelics is intended to be therapeutic. I mean, you find recreational use, you find like shamanistic use that's really not anything akin to therapeutic use. Then you do find, for example, in peyote ceremonies, ayahuasca ceremonies, something that it's kind of the poster child for like, okay, I can understand how this could be used therapeutically. But remember, I mean, lots of psychedelic use, even that involves shamans where you have like a single patient, doesn't necessarily involve the patient in air quotes, actually taking a psychedelic.
Mm.
And so I think there's a lot of assumptions being made when people try to boil down therapeutic psychedelic use in the form used in clinical trials to being some pale imitation of a more perfect shamanistic indigenous usage. People use psychedelics all kinds of ways, some of which overlap with an idea that we would have them being therapeutic and others don't. I'm not saying that, these other uses can't be like much better than what we might be trying to do.
Yeah.
I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that what we're doing is actually quite different from how psychedelics have typically been used.
What about this? Something I've been thinking about lately. I've heard that there's some research showing that, for example, traditional antidepressants and the SSRIs that came out decades ago, that their efficacy was much higher when they first came out, just because of you could almost call it the hype around them. Are you worried at all that psychedelics might be following in that path, in the sense that right now we are seeing huge benefits because we believe that they will have that effect, and because it is so cutting edge and bleeding edge and everyone going into it, even if we're trying to double blind some of the studies, is going into it with a fairly, even a secretly or an unconscious optimism that for example, if you think about traditional antidepressants right now, there's almost a pessimism culturally towards their efficacy. And we might even see that reflected in the data. And I'm curious if this is a potential outcome down the line of psychedelics as well. Again, sorry, I'm just because of what you said, it made me think about this. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on a potential sort of, that we're leading ourselves down a garden path of sorts.
Yeah. It's an excellent question. I mean, you asked, am I worried about that?
Mm-hmm.
I would say no, but I think that's going to happen. Just how could it not happen?
Yeah.
I mean, the effects are not going to get much, they're already huge. They're not going to get bigger than this. And this is true, like, look at the example of CBT. So like the cognitive behavioral therapy, huge, enormous effect sizes when this first came out. The trials, it's not due to a decline in quality, but the effect has just diminished over time. Part of that, I think, is hype and novelty of the new thing. With the antidepressant example, I mean, one way to understand that, in addition to the hype and kind of the placebo effect being amplified, is that if you have somebody who responds to an antidepressant in these early trials when you have no antidepressants, great. But if you're running a drug trial 20 years later, you can just go to a doctor, get prescribed an antidepressant. Why would you show up to some clinical trial?
So it totally, that makes a lot of sense.
And so I don't know exactly whether that's relevant to psychedelics, but yeah, I mean, this is not going to work for everyone. And those positive expectations can cut both ways, right? Like, you can get magnified placebo responses, you can get people that are willing to kind of put forth more changes than they otherwise might, but there's also disappointments. So it's hard to say, but in general, I think anytime you have a new treatment, you're going to see like the biggest effects up front, and as you expand it to more and more people, more complicated people, people that are less carefully selected, that effect is going to diminish.
Okay, so maybe we move into a more potentially positive direction, or even more potentially pessimistic direction. How do you feel that your work or psychedelics research in your subfield has changed in the last 5 years? About 5, you could go 5 to 10 years, but recently, have you seen any big changes for you or your work specifically, or maybe for the field at large?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, it's head spinning how quickly this all changes.
Pick one big change, maybe.
So like, okay, public perception has completely transformed. I mean, the general attitude towards these is quite positive at this point. And then there's money. There's lots of money now in psychedelics. And so that also changes the tenor. And both of these, for good or bad, this is going to push the field of psychedelic research forward. I can't even keep up with like all of the different research sites that are cropping up, all of the different companies that are getting involved in this work. I cannot even keep up with it.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case 5 years ago.
Yeah.
The speed essentially is the main thing that I see changing, the speed and the momentum.
Do you see that going exponentially into the next, half decade or decade? Or do you feel that is there a tapering, a plateau incoming, or is this
Well, no, because we're still in, like, remember, there's not a single psychedelic that has been approved for any kind of clinical use anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we can quibble about the definitions, but like, I think that once you do get an approval, that's going to be a shift, because for good and bad, but you're going to see, like much more widespread use of these outside of a research context. And so it's almost hard to, I mean, I think there's a before and after almost of that.
Thank you. Amazing. Okay. Well, I feel bad. I feel like I've already taken you away from your day probably a bit more than I aimed to. But before I let you go, have you by any chance looked into this year's Institute conference at all? Is there anything in particular you're looking forward to? This is a slightly, I guess, our promotional question in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I have looked at some of the talks, and there are several that I'm quite excited by. So, I mean, this is kind of what we were talking about earlier. Like more and more, I find myself, with some very clear exceptions, less and less interested in untangling the mechanisms of psychedelics, and more interested in understanding how to use them effectively clinically, but also how to understand conceptually what's going on. And Chris Leatherby's talk, essentially, he's a philosopher arguing that we should understand the experience causally. Excited to hear that. Manveer Singh's talk, who essentially is arguing that psychedelic use is not as ancient and old as we think. But the thing is, like, both of these get to like underlying assumptions that we have. It's very easy to look at an fMRI study and feel like, okay, that's where the real science is. But if we walk into this field with biases that we're not actually challenging or looking at, that's going to shape how we, in hidden ways, how we understand this field. And again, I think this field of research, or these drugs in particular, have an unparalleled ability at reflecting your assumptions back to you. So the Jungians who did psychedelic work in the 60s and 70s saw their patients had Jungian experiences. The psychoanalysts saw that their patients had these psychodynamic experiences. And if you had this idea that what's going on is that you're correcting these birth traumas, that's what you're going to see.
Yeah.
And so I think that these drugs are just far more flexible than we tend to give them credit for. In other words, if you have some kind of hidden bias, it's kind of like it can take you very far down certain directions without you realizing it. So I think these like very basic conceptual talks I'm going to find interesting.
Awesome. Seriously. Hey, I just want to thank you so much then for taking the time, and let you know that everyone here at Mind is looking forward to having you join us.
Yeah, pleasure talking to you.